Hello, I'm Richard with EV4U Custom Conversions, and welcome to our second episode in the A Beginner's Guide to EV Conversions. In this episode, we're going to talk about terms, some formulas, and we're going to start our discussion on batteries. But first, the role of genius is not to complicate the simple, but to simplify the complicated. And, you know, an observation in life in general, but especially in EV conversions, is some people just like to overcomplicate things. And by doing so, you decrease the reliability and you increase the cost typically. So we're going to, throughout this guide, we're going to stress simplicity, and we're going to stress doing things in a safe, simple, reliable, and affordable way. So let's start off with some commonly used terms, but the first one's not going to be common. But we're going to introduce it to you because it's something that all the others have in common, okay? And that is the coulomb. And the coulomb is a unit of charge, and it equals 6.25 times 10 to the 18th power electrons. So that's quite a few electrons, but that is a unit of charge. And the term for that unit of charge is the coulomb. One that we've all heard, matter of fact, GM named a car after it, and that's the volt. And a volt is the unit of electric potential and electromotive force, EMF. And kind of reduce it down here, the measure of amount of work required for moving 1 coulomb. Okay? So if you picture a battery and you have positive, negative terminals, between those two terminals there's a potential difference. And that potential difference or electromotive force is what we're talking about, and it's measured in volts. Next is the ampere, which we refer to as an amp. It's a unit of electric current, and charge moved by potential difference is current. Okay? So we're moving those electrons, that's current. And so current is the rate of flow of a charge. Again, we're coming back up to that charge always. Amp hour is another term that you'll hear, and it's just basically current over time. Okay? How much is going to go past this specific point in an hour, in this case, amp hour. Resistance isn't one that's heard a lot in discussion of EVs, but it is important. And resistance is simply the opposition to current flow. It's measured in ohms, represented by the Greek symbol omega. Now watts is one that people hear typically associated with kilowatts or kilowatt hours. And a watt is a unit of electrical power, and a kilowatt is simply 1,000 watts. Watt hour is, again, just like an amp hour. Instead of current over time, it's power over time. Okay? And we'll refer back to these things as we go forward. So now we're going to look at some formulas that basically represent the relationship between those things we just talked about. Volt, current, resistance, power. Okay? So these are our equations right here. And so E is for voltage, short for electromotive force. So E is for voltage, measured in volts. I, back when they first came up with these equations, they used I for intensity. But anyway, I is current, measured in amps. R is for resistance, measured in ohms. And power, P for power, is measured in watts, just like we mentioned a moment ago. So here are the equations. So volts is equal to the current times resistance. And basically any of these, if you have, two of them, you can figure the third kind of thing. So current is equal to the voltage over the resistance. Resistance is the voltage over the current. These you won't use quite as often, but in the EV world, we're going to use these much more often. And power is volts times amps, okay? Voltage times current. And the voltage is power divided by current, and current is power divided by voltage. That's all well and good. But here's a simpler way to remember these equations. So if you want to solve for one of these, you simply have a little pie chart here, or pie graph, and we got power, current, and volts. And if we want to know for the power, just simply picture this in your head. You cover the power, it's going to be current times volts. If you want to solve for the current, again, it'll be power over volts, so forth. Okay? Just an easy way to remember this and to be able to recall it. This is going to be the beginning of our discussion on batteries. And we're just going to start the discussion in this episode. There's a lot under the topic of batteries that we'll discuss, and so it's going to take more than one episode. But to start with, I want to kind of clarify a few things. And so we're kind of going back to the terms that we talked about a few moments ago. And so we're going to talk about our cells, modules, and batteries. And what exactly is a cell, what's a module, and what's a battery. They tend to be kind of misused, and people will talk about cells as batteries and so forth. So let's just get it kind of clarified from the get-go. So this is a AA tri-cell, what people will call a battery. It's not. It's a cell. It's a single cell. The AA is just the form factor, and nowadays you can get this same form factor, and you can get it in a lithium chemistry. You can get them all sorts of things. But anyway, AA is form factor, but it's a single cell. That's the point I'm trying to make. And the other point that you're going to see, and that is that the chemistry determines the voltage. So this is what we call a dry cell, okay, the traditional AA battery. And you notice I used the word battery because everybody's used to do that. Cell, AA cell. This is a D cell. Again, it's a dry cell. And dry cells are 1.5 volts. So this is 1.5 volts, this is 1.5 volts. The difference between these two, other than that form factor, is the capacity. This has more amp hours than this has. Greater capacity, thus the greater size. But they're the exact same voltage because they're the exact same chemistry. So these two were cells. This is a battery. And you're like, well, what's the difference? Well, this is a 9-volt battery. This has 6 dry cells in it. So it has 6 small cells like this. And 6 times 1.5 is 9. That's why it's 9 volts. It has 6 dry cells in it. This is a battery. And to be clear what a battery is, we're going to use Webster's dictionary. Defines a battery as a group of 2 or more cells connected together to furnish electric current. Key here, 2 or more cells connected together. Okay, so a single cell is not a battery. A single cell is a cell. This is a cell. This happens to be a lithium iron phosphate cell. This is 230 amp hours. It's 3.3 volts nominal. This is a single cell. This is not a battery. Now if we take a group of these and put them in a vehicle, then we would have a battery. And we refer to it as the battery pack. This is a battery. This is the same chemistry as that cell we just looked at. But it has 4 cells in here. So this is a battery. Okay? Again, just like the cell, you have a positive and negative terminals. We got positive and negative terminals on our battery also. But there's 4 cells wired in series in here to make this 12 volt battery. And this is a 40 amp hour battery. And we'll get into all of that later on as far as amp hours, voltage, and so forth. That's coming up. For the conversion, we're going to deal with cells, modules, and batteries. And some examples are what I just showed you as far as this is a lithium iron phosphate prismatic cell. That particular one that's made by Cal. We'll talk about batteries, and another example of a battery. I showed you that lithium iron phosphate battery a moment ago. Think about the 12 volt starting battery in your car. That's a wet cell, lead acid. They call it a 12 volt battery. We'll talk about that later too. But anyway, it has 6 cells in there. Okay, that's why it's a battery. It has 6 wet cells in there, lead acid. And then an example of a module, and it's used in the EV world and in conversions. An example would be a Tesla Model S module, and those typically have 444 cells in a module, and there are multiple modules in the battery pack. So a cell is an individual item that produces a potential difference. A module is a group of cells that is part of a larger battery pack. So we'll be talking, like I said, about all aspects of cells and modules and batteries. We're going to talk a lot more about all this as we go forward. And here's a few of the other things that we're going to be talking about in regards to cells and batteries, modules, chemistry, types, size, and by size I mean the capacity, containment, placement, so containing these cells so in an accident or whatever they don't go flying everywhere, placement, where we're going to place them in the vehicle, charging, voltage range, temperature range, how to care for them, safety, how many cells are you going to want, how many to use, managing, monitoring, and balancing. All that, and probably a little bit more as we move forward. We'll start with the first one here, and that's going to be battery chemistry. And the battery chemistries that we're going to discuss, we talked about the dry cells, wet cells, lead acid cells, and lithium cells. And so we're just going to talk a little bit about the dry cell and the lead acid cells, just as far as a little bit of basis. But 99% of the time, we're going to be talking about lithium cells. And another kind of misnomer out there is you hear people talk about lithium ion. Well, lithium ion is a generic term. There are lots of different types of lithium ion cells. Okay, lithium ion is a broad generic term. Lithium ion cells are available in a multitude of different chemistries. So there's, NMC, there's nickel, metal, cobalt, there's lithium iron manganese phosphate, there's lithium iron phosphate, and then on and on and on. Long list of different chemistries. But we're going to keep things simple. This is a beginner's guide. And we're going to talk mainly about one chemistry, and that is the lithium iron phosphate. And you'll see why as we go forward. So I mentioned before that the cell's chemistry determines its voltage. So a dry cell, 1.5 volts, like we talked about. Doesn't matter, AAA, AA, D, doesn't matter. They're all 1.5 volts. A lead acid cell, I mentioned, kind of chuckled about 12 volts. Well, 12 volt battery is not 12 volts. But a lead acid cell is 2.2 volts, fully charged. And so a 12 volt battery, as I mentioned earlier, has 6 cells in there. 6 times 2.2 is 13.2 volts. And so a fully charged 12 volt lead acid battery is 13.2 volts, not 12 volts. And they typically, because they have high internal resistance, if they sit for a while, they'll typically read 13 volts. Another item that we're going to discuss that I forgot to write down here, and that is wiring. Basically series or parallel wiring of the cells. Okay, so like I said, going forward, the chemistry we're going to talk about will be lithium iron phosphate, sometimes referred to as LiPo4 or LFP. The type of battery that we're really going to be using is referred to as a traction battery. And we touched on the other types. The reason you don't want to use, you'll see some of these batteries being sold on the internet, and this is an example. The labels coming off this just sits on our workbench. We use it on the workbench a lot. This is a lithium iron phosphate battery. Like I mentioned, I believe it's 40 amp hours. Yep. And but notice it says deep cycle. Those deep cycle batteries, and today they're kind of a hybrid because a lot of them, they call them a deep cycle marine RV battery. Originally a deep cycle battery was a battery that more along the storage heading, they moderate discharge for a long period of time. The marine RV ones, they're kind of a hybrid between a starting battery and a deep cycle or storage battery. And so what happens is a deep cycle battery isn't designed to be a traction battery. They're not built rugged enough. So if you look at the specs, a lot of these 12 volt lithium iron phosphate batteries that are coming out, they have limitations. A lot of them, they're only, 100 or 200 amps maximum output. And that's not that a cell, and some of them have cells just like this internally. And they may have 100 or 200 amp hours of capacity, but the discharge rate, and we'll talk more about this later on, isn't such that it can discharge the same amount as that single cell can, because of the internal connections between the interconnects between the cells, between that and the battery terminals, and the BMS. All those things interject limitations into these prepackaged batteries. We're using individual cells because they have the ability to put out a lot more current than one of these prepackaged kind of batteries. So you could take, if you're doing a 144 volt system, you could use 12 volt batteries, which we all know would be actually 156 volts on. And they just wouldn't have the discharge rate required for an EV. And so what's required is that traction style battery. Okay? So I do get quite a few questions from people, is this appropriate to use? And like I said, you look at the specs, no, not even close. No way you're going to be able to cruise down the freeway or accelerate with the current limitations that some of these prepackaged lithium batteries offer. So, more than enough said there. Next thing is, like I said, the size, the capacity. Well, a starting battery is typically rated in cold cranking amps. That's, the amount of amps that's available for a short period of time. And we're not interested in that. What we're interested in is a capacity, not so much, we are interested in that discharge rate, and there's, maximum discharge rate and a continuous discharge rate, and we'll talk about that later on. But when I'm talking about size, I'm talking about the storage capacity. And in a traction battery, they're rated in amp hours. Okay? So how many amps can it deliver over a period of time? So if you have a 100 amp hour battery, well, let's make it easier. Let's say you have a 20 amp hour battery. That, or cell, that has the ability to deliver 20 amps for 1 hour. Or it could deliver 1 amp for 20 hours. Or it could deliver 4 amps for 5 hours. You get the idea? So this is just a capacity of storage. How much current can it release over a period of time? Now let's talk about how we connect the cells. And so we connect them one of two ways. We can connect them in series or in parallel. And some of your battery packs, some of your modules do a combination of both. They'll have series parallel arrangements, and we'll talk about that in a moment. First, let's talk about a series setup. So we're going to use a 12 volt battery for our discussion here, And we're going to use a 36 watt load. Remember, watts is the unit for power. So the amount of power that we're consuming from these batteries is 36 watts. So in a series circuit, our cells are connected from positive to negative, positive to negative. And so then this right here would be my most positive point in this little circuit, and this is the most negative. And between those 2 points, we're going to have 36 volts. And that's because we have 3 batteries at 12 volts. And that's 36 volts then. So in series, the voltage adds because it's going through each one of these. So now we have 36 volts and we're consuming 36 watts. So what's going to be the current going through our circuit here? Well, remember the formula we had before? And if you remember our little diagram, so if we want to solve for I, for the current, it'd be power over volts. So 36 watts divided by 36 volts, that's going to be 1 amp. It's going to be 1 amp going through each one of these cells and through our load. And, you know, why are these formulas important? Well, one, we now know how much current is going to be drawn through this circuit. We know what size that we would, that we would make our fuse. So this is a symbol for a fuse, and we'll go over this stuff later on. The size of the wire, the size of the fuse, a switch, if we had a switch in here, all of that can be dictated by these numbers. That's why it's important. Okay, so one other aspect that we want to talk about. Say each one of these is 10 amp hours. In this series circuit, the amp hours, because this 1 amp is going through each one of these, we have a 36 volt battery at 10 amp hours. Okay? Now we're going to contrast that to the cells that are put in parallel. In parallel, all of our positives are wired together and all of our negatives are wired together. We're still using 3 12-volt batteries. We're going to again assume that these all 3 are 10 amp hours. So, in a in a parallel circuit like this, each one of these is connected together, positive to positive, negative to negative. And so, the voltage at these 2 points is going to be 12 volts. So now we have a 12 volt battery. And the current, we've got the same load, and again, using the same formula, well, 36 watts divided by 12 volts is going to be 3 amps. So this would be 3 amps right here. Okay? But as this is just one circuit here, current flow is going through this like this. So the current is the same through the entire circuit. In this one, we have 3 amps here, but going through this little branch circuit right here, little branch circuits, we have 3 branch circuits here. We have 1 amp through each one of these. for a total of 3 amps. Okay, so in the series circuit, the same current through the entire circuit. In a parallel, the total current flow is the sum of all the branch circuits. So the other thing is, whereas the capacity did not change, we have 10 amp hours of capacity. In these, we have 3 cells that are connected together, so it's like one big 12 volt cell. So the capacity actually adds here. So you got, 12 volts, and we're going to have 30 amp hours. Where in this series setup, we have 36 volts, 10 amp hours. Okay, so you can see that in series the voltage adds, but the capacity stays the same. In parallel, the voltage stays the same and the capacity adds. So one other thing that we want to look at, in this series circuit and this parallel circuit, what is the power there? Well, remember power is going to be volts times amps, amps times volts, however you want to look at it. So if we take 36 volts times 10 amps, we're going to have 360 watt hours. That's the capacity of this battery pack. 3 12 volt batteries wired in series. Here we have 3 12 volt batteries wired in parallel. So what's the capacity here? 12 times that's going to be 360 watt hours. Same capacity, different voltage. There's a lot of material, and that's why this video series is going to be a lot of episodes, because we can only get to so much. And the other thing with doing something like this is you're going to see as we go forward, we introduce something and we'll come back to it later on. It's because everything is so interrelated. You have to have some basic understanding before we can get into it deeper. So we introduce the topic and then we come back to it and go a little deeper next time. Speaking of next time we're going to talk about how many cells do we need for a conversion. Okay? And how are we going to wire them? Series or parallel? So that and a lot more in our next episode. Hope you'll join me. Please like and subscribe. Hit that notification bell. And see you next time.